SSMS and Azure Data Studio step into the ring to duke it out. But wait, who are these other competitors? Welcome to this video on SQL Server tooling. My name is Kevin Fiesel. I'm the proprietor of Galaxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. In this video, we will talk about 5 Microsoft created or sponsored tools for connecting to SQL Server. We talk all the time about SQL Server Management Studio and Azure Data Studio, but they aren't the only kids in this family. Let's talk about 5 client tools in turn. I'm going to start with the big dog in this space, SQL Server Management Studio. SSMS has been with us in some form or another since SQL Server 2005, and version 19 just recently came out. It used to be that you needed the SQL Server installation media to get Management Studio, but nowadays it's available from Microsoft's website, and the installation media just points you to that location. The last several versions of SSMS have been built on the Visual Studio shell, which means that certain keyboard shortcuts and behaviors mimic what we see in Visual Studio. If that means nothing to you, carry on. DBAs essentially live their lives in SQL Server Management Studio, as it's an extremely capable tool with wizards, and it does a great job of exposing SQL Server's capabilities. But ultimately, everything SSMS is doing boils down to T-SQL statements against an instance, and one of the best features of SQL Server Management Studio is the script button, which appears on most pages. This script button lets you see what SSMS itself is doing, so you can either save the script in a repository as proof that you did indeed click a button, or you can learn from the tool and write your own scripts in the future. That little button is one of the smartest things the SQL Server Client Tools team has ever done. Now that I've hit the basics of why this is a great tool for admins, let's talk about it from the perspective of a developer. For a dev, the tool is fine. I think there's a better client tool for developers out there, and we'll get to it in a moment. But if all you have is SQL Server Management Studio, you'll get by pretty well. One big critique I have of the product comes from the fact that I do a lot of presenting and product demos. SQL Server Management Studio does not make life easy for you if you're presenting in a room. You can increase the zoom level of a script text, but that tree menu to the left and the result sets below are fixed size, and you have to manually adjust them in the settings menu. I know that there's a presenter mode for Management Studio, but even that's not great. I've gotten to the point where I'd rather use a tool like Zoom It to zoom in and out on my screen rather than trying to fight SSMS. The other big critique I have is this is a Windows-only tool. If you're running on Linux or Mac OS, forget about trying to get it to work. You'd be better served building a Windows VM and connecting to it, or using a different tool altogether, like say Azure Data Studio. This tool came out of the need for more cross-platform and developer-friendly tooling in a SQL Server on Linux world. Azure Data Studio is built from Visual Studio Code, itself based on the Electron platform. This makes Azure Data Studio cross-compatible with a variety of operating systems, so we can run it natively on Linux or Mac OS. One thing to keep in mind if you're a regular SQL Server Management Studio user is that SSMS has been around for nearly 2 decades, whereas the first public release of Azure Data Studio was January of 2019. Barely 4 years ago. We've seen the SQL Server Client Tools team add a lot of functionality to Azure Data Studio over the past few years. So if you're a database developer and the last time you looked at the product was 2020, it's probably worth another look. Azure Data Studio has some great functionality for developers, including the ability to work with notebooks and a growing set of extensions to incorporate new functionalities such as database projects, data virtualization, support for Postgres and MySQL. Also, I tend to like its result set behavior more than I do SQL Server Management Studios, as you can easily sort and filter from result sets without needing to modify your query. This is great in cases where it's computationally easy to get a few hundred or a couple thousand rows, but it's a lot harder to get exactly the row you need. Or where you've written an expensive query that you just don't want to run a second time. You can also easily zoom in and out, and that includes all app assets, making it easier and a lot more convenient for demos. In demo mode, I can make sure everybody is able to see my results, but then I can switch it back to tiny mode when working on my own. Nonetheless, Azure Data Studio is not going to work for everybody. If you're primarily an administrator, it's still easier to do many things in SSMS versus Azure Data Studio. And let's face it, if you've worked with a product for 15 or 20 years, you're likely to be reticent to move to a new product. There's a lot of muscle memory built up after all. Azure Data Studio's execution plan viewer has been significantly worse than what was in SSMS, but a recent product update has improved its capabilities. Still, when I need to perform an analysis, I'm using SolarWinds SQL Sentry Plan Explorer instead of either of those. Those are the two major client tools for SQL Server. There are, of course, multi-product client tools we could discuss, but not in this video. If you want me to dig into third-party client tools which include SQL Server support, let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, let's talk about 3 command line tools for SQL Server. The first is OSQL, a tool which has been around for a very long time. OSQL is on the chopping block, however, so if you rely on it for anything, know that it will probably disappear from some future version of SQL Server. Or it'll live in zombie mode like database mirroring, never getting any updates or bug fixes and always hungering for the flesh of the living. The big benefit to OSQL is that it's installed with SQL Server, meaning that if you're in a real bind and absolutely need to connect to a SQL Server instance but don't have any other client tools installed, you can use this. This is only available on Windows. But instead of using OSQL, Microsoft recommends you use SQL Command, which also comes with SQL Server. But you can also install this as part of the SQL Server command line utilities. SQL Command is available for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, making it a cross-platform tool for running SQL scripts. The documentation shows off a variety of command line switches you can use. Something you can do in SQL Command, but cannot do naturally in SSMS or Azure Data Studio, is variable substitution, which allows you programmatically to replace strings in SQL Command scripts, even in places where T-SQL doesn't natively accept variables. Within SSMS, you can get the same kind of functionality by turning on SQL Command mode in the query menu when you have a query tab open. The last tool we'll look at here is MS SQL Command Line, a command line tool for SQL Server, which is not Microsoft owned, but did receive some early love from the company and has several Microsoft contributors. This is actually a Python package that you can get from pip or by installing a separate wheel file. Once you have it installed, MS SQL CLI serves as an interactive command line interface for SQL Server. This is a bit different from OSQL or SQL Command in that those two are intended to be batch processors, meaning you submit a batch, T-SQL executes the batch, you get a response back, you're done. With MS SQL CLI, you can page through results with the PyPager package. There are also keyboard shortcuts for common commands like listing databases, listing tables, views, indexes, things of that sort. It's a pretty neat solution. The one risk is that, as of the time of this recording, MS SQL CLI hasn't received an update in more than 6 months, and there are some project's dependencies with known vulnerability. Hey, this is Kevin coming at you from Days of Future Past. So it turns out, since the time I did that recording, there have been some updates to the MS SQL CLI library. That's the good news. The bad news is that most of the updates are mostly to say that MS SQL CLI is being deprecated. So it will be replaced with a Go SQL Command utility, a utility which is written entirely in Go instead of Python. That particular utility is currently in preview, so I'm not going to do any demonstrations of it today. We'll see if it ends up being a successful long-term solution for Microsoft or if it ends up being another MS SQL CLI. Hopefully it's more the former than the latter, because this is intended to be another cross-platform solution for executing SQL code from a command line. But we saw what happened with MS SQL CLI, so stay tuned, we'll find out in the future. So there you have it, 5 client tools for SQL Server, at least 4 of which are good to use. Which client tools do you use? Are you a command line junkie griping that I gave short shrift to SQL Command or MS SQL CLI? Have you made the move to Azure Data Studio, or perhaps tried it and switched back? Will they pry SSMS from your cold, dead hands? Let me know in the comments. We'll have links and show notes in the description below. And until we see each other in the next video, take care.